Well, hi guys, it's great to meet up at last. Zoom's brilliant, but it's not quite the same as sitting round the table, albeit 2 metres apart, and having some coffee or even a water. But I suppose before we start, we should introduce ourselves to those who are watching this morning. So, I'm Gordon Craig, I'm the oil and gas chaplain, and I've been doing this role for the last 8 years. Before that, I was a Royal Air Force chaplain, and I spent 22 years doing that. In all that time, chaplaincy is about supporting people, and it's about supporting them in whatever they're going through, whether it be mental health issues or other issues. So that's kind of where I'm from, a number of years supporting people in these kind of environments.
So my name's Brett Townsley. I run Omniscient Safety Innovations, which is a company that specialises in bespoke mental health solutions for all types of industries. We're currently working within the energy sector. That's partly my background. I'm a health and safety person from the energy sector. Previous to that, I was in the armed forces also, Fleet Air Arm and Intelligence Exploitation Force. And what I've done and what my business does is we look at the impacts of mental health, the stressors that are created in the workplace, and we look to provide preventative solutions rather than the kind of typical reactive kind of employee assistance approaches that are normally taken. And that's what's brought me to the table today, gents.
My name's Bob Gardner. I'm a medic and health and safety advisor for TACA. I guess I'm a bit of a veteran as well, but not of the armed forces, but a veteran of the health service, and I've been offshore now for 35 years. So I guess most of my role has been as a medic, caring for people either in a physical or psychological sense. So hopefully, as I say, I may be here in a medical capacity, although as I'm sure as time goes on, I don't like labels when it comes to mental health.
This could be quite a fascinating discussion because we come to this table with different backgrounds.
Yeah.
I wonder, one of the things which I hear spoken about a lot is, how do you spot the signs of mental health? How do they come across? Maybe
it's a really, really good question because everybody sort of shouts out, what are the signs and symptoms? But you know, it's actually much more subtle than that. For me, the offshore is about almost, it's a sense of family that you know each other really well, and it can be something really subtle. It's just that, you know, Gordon's not just quite himself today. He's a little bit withdrawn, he's a bit off colour, he's actually getting a little bit nippy. I wonder what's wrong with him. And for me, it's more just that emotional thing and just that little subtle changes in behaviour that you'll spot rather than something that's florid.
Yeah, so again, when we sort of assess mental health in the workplace and the emotional hazards it presents, what we tend to look at is patterns. So we look at, again, much has been mentioned there by Bob, we look at the behavioural changes in individuals. If we start to see significant changes within that individual from their normal kind of behavioural patterns, whether it be emotional, physical or behavioural, it's often an indicator that there's something deeper underlying. There are different stages within mental health processes. Absolutely. So, you know, you have a coping stage, you have a struggling stage, and then you have a crisis stage. One of the difficulties is actually being able to identify people who are in the coping stage because the changes are not so significant. They're, as you said, Bob, they're slight, they're smaller. So having the ability to kind of identify that, but also tie it back to, as you rightly say, sort of knowing the person and the changes that are ongoing with the individual allow you the opportunity to intervene successfully.
I think that's the key, isn't it? Knowing the person and spotting the changes. And what I find fascinating is that for a lot of people, if they're looking at a colleague or whatever, they're looking at change, but usually they're looking for a change which, how could I describe it, in a downward way, they feel down. But actually it can go the other way, and they can go,
absolutely.
You think, what's going on here? He's not normally just as jovial as that, and that joviality can be a real sign that they're putting on
a good mask, putting on the mask, as it were.
Significant change in any way, shape or form is a good indicator that something different is going on. And if we look at the outside factors, contributing factors from the outside, big life changes have an impact on us. So divorce, financial issues, loss. So if we lose someone close to us, again, the thought behind that is that someone who potentially has gone through one of those major changes within a year timescale is far more likely to be susceptible to the kinds of work stressors and mental health issues that we would look to prevent. So that can be a good indicator for us as well.
looking at me, it's always easier to talk about others, isn't it? But when you turn it into ourselves, how do we spot it in ourselves?
That's a really good question, because often from my perspective, the questions almost framed, who cares for the carers? You know, we're going through this whole thing with COVID, and we're talking about people in the health service. Who's looking after the people in the front line? It's very difficult to look inward, because one of the things that I found people who've had mental health issues, as I say, they put this mask on, and they can actually hide what's actually going on very, very well. Hide that in the workplace. We hear about people who are absent from work, but there's a thing called presenteeism as well, where people are at work, they've perhaps got a mental health issue, they're working, but they're perhaps not functioning as well as possible. Again, it's a very, very subtle thing, but recognising it in yourself is a big thing if you can actually say, hey, but it's just taking that big step and asking for help.
It's far more difficult to recognise it internally, absolutely. Human beings are built to accept more and more stress. You know, we all do it. Oh, I can take more, I can take more. Even some of the concepts around mental health kind of build that into us, along with the perceptions of, you know, men must be tough, we don't talk about emotion, those kinds of things. The military's, you know, a big one. If your arm's not falling off, you know, then you're not going to medic. So, you know, but to recognise it internally, we do have some toolkits internally at OSI, but there are simple things we can do, understanding again our own changes in pattern and behaviour. If I suddenly see myself failing to attend, a little more difficult in these settings, but social events, and deliberately looking for excuses to opt out of it, I can start to determine my own behaviour is changing, and therefore I can risk assess that maybe there's something not quite right.
But I think you're right, it's much easier to see it in someone else than it is to see it in yourself.
Absolutely.
I'm with you, Brett. I find if I'm under a lot of stress, I kind of start withdrawing a bit, and I don't want to go and speak to people. And actually, you think, oh, the last thing I want to be doing is sitting around here doing this. Kid on. Bob, a question for you. In the offshore environment, who do you think, if someone was, if somebody spotted or somebody sees somebody struggling with mental health, who should they go to? Do you know what?
It's a really, really good question. Obviously, you've obviously got the medic who is the healthcare professional on the platform. But for me, the first instance is often if you've got a bit of trust with a friend or a colleague. I think that's probably the best person to go and send something off. Again, I think if you're getting to the stage of the medic, perhaps you're having a little bit more of a problem. You're probably looking for help and looking for somebody to signpost you to that help. For me, it's much more about the family. It's about the looking out for each other. It's about the friend, the colleague. Obviously, there are other people to discuss it with, but perhaps it's at a different stage that you might actually want to take that to a manager, to a supervisor. For me, the first port of call is somebody that you trust and somebody that you know well.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I find that for most people, I think for everyone, the hardest part is initially to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling. You've got to go to the person you feel comfortable with. And that could be a mate, it could be anyone, it could be a professional. I find, though, that if somebody approaches me and they've gone through that really difficult door of saying, I'm not quite right here, it's often good to then suggest to them that you could perhaps travel with them to go and see somebody. So if I was offshore and it was a colleague of mine, a mate of mine who said to me, Gordon, I'm really struggling, I could say to him, if we both, and this is where it comes down, it's all relationships, but if we both had a good relationship with the medic on board, for instance, or a supervisor, whoever it is, how about we both go along and we explain what's happening, and that sometimes can help.
So people find it very difficult to talk to line managers or supervisors and disclose anything about mental health. And again, there's a relation back to stigma there.
It's exactly the key word. It's the word I was thinking about was this stigma.
Absolutely.
It's still the elephant in the room for in men's health in particular.
Absolutely. Mental health still has that huge stigma that surrounds it. You know, it's very easy to talk or approach someone and say, oh, what happened to you there? You know, with a plaster on. Great, I can easily have that conversation. But talking about what's going on in there with somebody is far more difficult. However, it really shouldn't be, because it's conversation, essentially. That's all it is. But the point I did want to kind of make, and it reflects what you guys have actually said, is peer support structures are far more successful than direct line management or reporting lines. People are far more likely to converse with a peer or some form of champion, first aid, or whatever it may be deemed, that has a particular skill set and knows to encourage the person on to appropriate care. But then the structures have to be there to support the people to do it around systemic approaches in your work.
It's all that signposting and knowing where to start that journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that brings me to a point, I think, and it was raised in one of the questions that came in from offshore. It's fine when you're in a peer group, when you've got colleagues and friends around, but if you're a contractor who's been dumped, as it were, on a platform, where do you go?
I guess maybe that's perhaps where a medic could come in if they didn't know anybody in particular, just to have that confidential conversation that you have with the medic. So perhaps that's a good starting point for somebody. But again, it's having that confidence to go there. It's easy to say it. It's a much different thing to actually do it.
So again, we would approach it in a much more systemic sort of solution to it. So again, contractor-specific peer support structures. So if a business, and I'm going to go back a few steps. So I'm going to go right back to, the business having a duty of care, and what you guys say is absolutely true. We have a duty of care for each other. Absolutely, to look out for each other and be able to identify the signs and intervene. But the business has a duty of care for everyone that works there. And in order to do that, contractors are no different. No. There should be peer support structures in place to support them to get the right levels of support. My experience is not great with this because I've not seen many people who do this very well. However, the truth is it can be done, and there are solutions out there that can include your contractors and allow them.
A good example of that is an employee assistance program. Now, while I work for an operator and it's designated for the operator, they've actually opened up to anybody that works on the operator's platform. So there are these opportunities to use that assistance as well.
And employee assistance programs are a great tool. And again, but where I would look at them is more in a reactive state in the sense of you have to already have the mental health problem to then be contacting them. Where really we want to get to is by putting the mechanisms in, the likelihood is reduced of them ever getting to that stage where they need employee assistance. But you're absolutely right, employee assistance programs are a great tool, but they should be one of a strategical approach to it.
We've been talking about the workplace at the moment. Another area, of course, which we all feel stress around is the home life. And the offshore community have a fairly unique experience of this in that they can be off for 3 weeks, back for 2, or off for 2, back for whatever. But we've all been there where we go home and we experience that kind of, I'm just shattered, geese piece. And the kids want your attention, your partner wants your attention, and actually you're just fatigued and you can't do it. And that therefore creates this kind of melting point of tension, and how do we help? What can we do?
So I think you made a key point there, fatigue. So much of the fatigue assessments I ever saw as a health and safety professional, and even up to now as a consultant for mental health solutions, is around physical fatigue. We don't look at mental fatigue, which essentially is a large piece of the puzzle. The offshore rota, or offshore working environment, has two specific additional elements to it. The high hazard area, and then additionally, as you rightly said, that movement between the offshore working life and then back to home life. Again, we don't look at decompression settings, so we never look at you're in one high hazardous zone for a long period of time, or 3 weeks, whatever it may be. Now you're suddenly shifted back to normal life, which isn't high hazard level, is not high stress in the same types of ways, but does your stress and anxiety levels match? Have you come back? Have you had time to normalise your pattern? That doesn't happen. That's something we're not good at, again, in the offshore environment. The military is a really good example of it. The armed forces deploy for long periods of time, and while you're on deployment, it may be inactive, again, for large chunks of that, but there may be high levels of stress and anxiety for short periods of time. But your anxiety level naturally rises on the deployment. So it's continually going up, even in sort of low-level experiences. By the time you go home, you're up here. You're not where you should be down here. That's why they've introduced decompression through 2 weeks on cafeteria or whatever it may be, to allow the human body and the mind to readjust before it transits back.
In my experience, some of the issues around this home life is down to just lack of communication. It's like mental health issues as a whole. We kind of hide behind them. We don't want to speak about them. And for many, they come home, but they don't explain why they're unable to explain.
It's an easy thing for a man
partner.
to do, though, is it? And I'm using an example, but to have that communication, to be open and to be honest, and to just get it on the table, as it were.
Absolutely. Again, you're absolutely right. Especially men, have great difficulty in being able to express emotions.
Yeah.
Often, this is why, again, one of self-harm and these kinds of things are a way of letting out emotions that we're not very good at expressing. But absolutely right. Communication, I think, is key. But we need to break down those barriers. We need to make it acceptable for men, the North Sea Tigers, to be able to talk about mental health.
It just keeps coming back to the word talk, communicate, talk, communicate.
Listening, I think, is a key as
Listening's
well.
one.
You have to pay attention to what people, not just verbally. I have to be looking at you and reading body language. The kind of micro movements you make, whether your verbal tone actually agrees with those micro movements, all of those kinds of body language, as you say. And I have to be able to take all that on board and say, okay, you might be telling me you're fine, but actually everything else is saying to me you're not.
Yeah.
So I have to intervene, not just walk away, which is too easy. If we get the answer, yeah, I'm fine, it's too easy to then just go, well, I did it. I'm off, I can walk away.
So I've done my bit.
My duty of care here is taken care of. So.
It's interesting, as I travel around the industry, I've seen some quite stark differences in the approach to mental health from individuals and companies. And some operators out there have put in a lot of effort into promoting mental health. And me, as an outsider visiting their installations, I can see the difference. So it does work, because I won't name the companies, I won't name the operators or the platforms, but I've been amazed sometimes at landing on an installation and almost immediately people are talking to me about things in language. I think, wait a minute, where do you get all this language from? And it turns out they've had mental health programs at work. And so for any of the companies that are a bit dubious about all this, I would say go for it, because it does make a difference. Now, staying on the offshore kind of area again, there was another interesting question came in from a safety rep, and it was based along the fact that if somebody goes off with a broken leg, when they come back, they're offered all sorts of support, and it's what can we do for you, da-di-da-di-da. But if somebody goes off with a mental health issue, nobody knows how to deal with it when they come back on. Do we talk about it? Do we ignore it? What would your response to that be?
Firstly, I'd agree with that. I think, again, we're not very good at tackling physical ailment and mental health ailment in the same way. So if I give you a little story of two people who join the same company, same level of experience, same knowledge, they are identical. One gets trained into a job, moves into a role, has not had sufficient training for that role, then has a severe accident and injures himself physically. We'll investigate, we will go back and do lessons learned on it, we will put preventative measures in place. They will get employee assistance when they return back to work, we'll integrate them back in appropriately. Same person, same issue, not trained for the role, ends up overwhelmed, ends up depressed and is off for 6 months with clinical depression or some other form of mental ill health. What will we do? We won't investigate where the root cause was. We certainly won't go back and say, right, let's fix that so the next person doesn't experience that. And we won't do, as you rightly said, the same kind of mechanisms to get them back into the workplace successfully. We need to, as a culture, not just as offshore or any type of industry, we need to look at it in the same setting and say we need to normalise mental health to the point where we can attack it in the same approach as we do with physical health.
I think a lot of it comes back to what we were mentioning earlier about talking about, because one of the first initial reactions I have is somebody coming back in the workplace is respecting their confidentiality.
Sure. Absolutely.
So does that person want to talk about it first and foremost? I think you've got to go back to the individual. And I think if somebody, for me, I can think of people coming back into the work who've had issues, have been off with depression, anxiety, whatever it is, and having conversations with HR and almost putting things in place to manage them back into the workplace. You know, if you're lucky to work for a bigger operator and you've got an occupational health department, you can manage people and transition them back into work much easier than just throwing somebody back into the sharp end.
So here, and I agree with that, but here's where I find that slightly difficult is most people will not disclose that it was a mental health issue that took them off in the first place.
Right.
So the difficulty then becomes the Occ Health team, and this is no fault of their own, but again, they will try to manage a problem that does not exist because they're managing perhaps a physical ailment that is caused by mental health. When really what we need to be managing is the mental health issue. So the person transitioning back to work never has a successful transition because we've tried to fix a problem that doesn't really exist. So again, where I think in a proactive sense we need to get to is if we can normalise mental health to the point where people are free to say, actually I'm not off work because I've got stomach flu or whatever it may be, I've got work-related stress, which is caused by X, Y, and Z. Now the company's duty of care, let's go in and look at that, and if it's a real problem, let's fix the problem, and let's get the person back to work properly and take care of them. So I agree. I do think, good Occ Health departments help to manage it back, but the problem is the trust isn't there to disclose it openly.
I think which can back that confidentiality right at the start.
Absolutely.
So back to the basics then, because if somebody's watching this just now offshore, and if Jimmy's just come back, his mate, and he knows he's had a mental health, what should he do? Should he be talking to Jimmy about it? Should he not?
Absolutely.
Employees are protected by certain legislation, so disclosing a mental health issue should not lead to the kinds of consequences that stigma leads you to believe, even self-stigma, where you stigmatise yourself thinking these things. So honesty, let's get trust back into the workforce, let's talk about it openly, and then we can really create solutions.
One of the safety reps has asked this, and I'll read it because I think it deserves to be read out. 2 to 1 and POB increases have put such a heavy burdens on privacy offshore just now. Rest and recovery. It's akin to living in an airport all the time with someone always wanting your space. Now you can see the stress there, and having no privacy. What advice would you give for somebody to look after the mental health in that situation?
For me personally, one of the things I've learned over the last couple of years is to actually practice mindfulness, where you actually just take a bit of time and actually step back inside your own mind. If you can think of maybe somebody that's having a mental health issue, if you can just imagine you've got a super highway in there and there's cars going in 8 different lanes, it's about just trying to slow the traffic down and concentrate on one car. It's just about looking into yourself and just trying to slow things down, take a little bit of time. I agree with that. I think mindful is a great philosophy that should be adopted not only by the individual but by the businesses themselves. Yeah.
I think the point is there's probably a twofold there. The individual absolutely should be looking to ways to manage stress appropriately.
But the organisation as well.
The organisation has a responsibility to address that. So if there are specific stressors created by the work environment, the responsibility lies with the business to say, have we done enough to mitigate those? Have we done enough to prevent that? Is that going to cause severe harm or is there a risk of it happening? And if it is, then we have a responsibility to address it. One
of the things that strikes me and has struck me over the years is that when we're under stress and for whatever reason, of course we're built such that the emotional side of our brain takes priority over the rational, which is why it's so good to talk, because we start thinking with our emotions, or not thinking as the case may be. We react with our emotions, and sometimes we all, it can be such a great help just to have a buddy or a mate just to sit down and go, come on, no, here's the black and white of it, not here's the emotional side. Absolutely. And just chatting that through can make a big difference.
A problem shared's a problem halved.
Exactly. But I think we've just about reached the end of our chat now, I think. Okay. And it's been fascinating for me. And I think one thing that's come across is we've all agreed with each other too, I think, in everything that's been said from our different backgrounds. And as we said at the beginning, it's been great to meet up and chat in the flesh at last. So.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me along.
Thank you.